this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbite. Ben Kinsley is here. Ben is a sponsor of our show. Thank you, Ben, so much.
Thank you, Pat.
He's the principal of Imperium Advisors in Burlington. Want to give a little PR about what it is you do?
We do a whole bunch of different stuff, everything from government relations to public policy development, media relations, a whole bunch of different things, mostly for nonprofits, kind of in the political space. So, yeah.
He's our policy wonk on this show.
Exactly,
So and our guest tonight is a repeat guest, Josh Unrah, who is the Selectboard Chair from Vernon, Vermont. Welcome again. You're too far away to. And the topic tonight is the sale of Vermont Yankee is complete, and decommissioning has begun. And this has been of interest to a lot of Vermonters for many years.
Yes.
Hasn't it? But before we start, maybe you could talk a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the Select Board Chair in Vernon. I'm also the Assistant Emergency Management Director in Vernon. I'm the President of the Recreation Department in Vernon. And a recent governor-appointed member of the Vermont Capp, the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel.
Great. So that's what you get for volunteering. You start volunteering in a town and you're sucked in.
And eventually you start getting voluntold at a certain point.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, I got voluntold onto the Solid Waste Committee actually at the last Select Board meeting. So.
Excellent. Well, good for you. That's great. That's great. So we're going to talk about Vermont Yankee, but I just thought maybe we could remind people about the timeline. I know it's quite extensive, but I think there's some people that really don't know the history. It's as it's gone on, you don't hear about it much anymore. And I know we were involved in the legislature.
Except in the context of decommissioning,
Except for the decommissioning and the fund.
Yep.
So can you give us a quick kind of review of how this all progressed and where we are now?
Yeah, so actually Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Corp started in 1966. It was formed by a couple of large utilities in the state of Vermont, the Vermont Public Service Corp and Green Mountain Power.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know Green Mountain Power was involved in this.
Yep.
I mean, in the start. Good. Oh.
They were
See,
the original
you always
group.
learn something. That's
Well,
interesting.
fun fact, they almost put it in Charlotte.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Moving on. Let's not get into that.
That's funny. So in 72 is actually when the construction was complete and they started generating power out of that facility. It had about 650 employees during its operating time. The average wage right when the power plant closed was just over $100,000. So that's from the maintenance guy all the way up to the nuclear engineers. The average wage was over $100,000 at that plant. So there was a lot of money coming through that plant on a regular basis, and a lot of good people that are no longer there.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that a little bit later, the impact of them leaving with the high salaries and talented people.
Yeah.
And was that, so you said around 650 employees at its peak. That's not how many were there at the time of the time the plant closed,
No, they started cutting back on staff as they were getting closer to decommissioning through the decommissioning process. Right now, there's about 100 people that are involved in the decommissioning process currently. About 30 or 40 of which were retained by North Star, who is the new owner of the Vermont Yankee, from Entergy.
Right.
So, fortunately, there was, those handful of people that got to stay with the corporation and work through the decommissioning.
And I assume most of those jobs still probably have an expiration date, though.
Yes, at some point, when the facility is completely decommissioned and gone, there will be an expiration date. Probably about 10 years from now is our hope and guess at this point. So. So the plant was fully online in 1972, and then it was sold about 30 years later, right? Yes, it was sold to Entergy. So those two utilities sold it to the Entergy Corporation in 2002 for $180 million. So
It's pretty big by Vermont standards.
Yes,
Yeah,
it
really,
is.
big
Yes, it
bucks.
is. It was a big transaction, especially
And
for
did they
the
have
two
to go
utilities.
through the NRC, go through our public,
Yep.
I don't know what they called it back then, Public Utility Commission, they changed the
Yeah,
name
it
of
wasn't the
it
Public
somewhere.
Utility Commission
Yeah,
at the time.
Public Service.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was called. There was a different name to it.
Yeah.
It just changed like maybe 3 years ago
Right.
to the Public Utility
Yeah.
Commission.
So they had to go
So-
through that whole process,
Yes.
like
Yep.
they did with the new owners.
Yep.
Yeah, and Entergy owned it for about a decade, right?
Yes.
Before they really kind of started looking at the decommissioning process.
Yeah, they announced closure in 2013. So they had it for about a decade, and it was just due to the amount of tax that they were getting levied by the state, and
Right.
it was no longer a profitable business when you were paying that much to the state of Vermont.
And part of it also, I think, was competition from low-cost fossil fuels like natural gas, right?
Natural gas is a big player in the power scene right now, and
Yep.
very big competition to nuclear.
Yep. So, so that decommissioning plan was announced in 2013. What's kind of happened since then? Maybe just to catch people up, because I'm sure they've heard about it in the news, but it's kind of,
Yep.
yeah, a little bit of a.
So they ended up closing the plant officially, all done, generating power in December of 2014. And that's when a lot of the layoffs started happening, and a lot of folks left town and went to other nuclear plants to work. Some started their own business. There was several people that were, close to retirement age, so they just took their retirement early, and it was a good group of people that the communities and the regions lost in one way or another out of the job circle.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big chunk of revenue for the community that's
Oh,
suddenly
absolutely.
gone.
Yeah.
Yep. So since that time, in 2018 is when the actual sale was completed to North Star. So North Star Group Services is a demolition company. They've been around for a long time. I believe they have around 3,000 employees across the country. They have different regional headquarters throughout the country as well. It's the one out of Boston that comes up to work at the Vernon plant. So they've been a really good corporate partner for us thus far. They've always kept us in the loop as far as what was going on. So if we had any questions in the community, we would be able to answer
Good for
them.
them.
And they've been a really great partner for the community.
And they came with a plan that was much shorter in time than
Yes.
most anybody else, right?
Yes.
There was one that was 60 years, if I'm remembering
Yes.
correctly. I know
Correct.
way too
And that
much
was
about this.
Entergy
Yes.
had the 60-year plan.
Right.
Yes.
A lot of that had to do with this savings account, right?
Yes, correct.
That essentially is where the decommissioning funds are held. And Entergy didn't really have, my understanding of it anyway, Entergy didn't really have an incentive to decommission faster because
Correct.
they were gaining interest on that account,
Yep.
right?
Right.
Yep. And Entergy is obviously not a deconstruction, decommissioning company.
They don't have the expertise.
Their expertise is to, run power plants. So when they do a decommissioning, which they've done before, a lot of it's subcontracted. It's subcontracted to folks like North Star to do the actual work itself. And, getting pieces done at a time, it was a 60-year timeline. With North Star at the helm, we're looking at a 10-year timeline to be done.
That's
Right.
amazing, isn't it, that they can do that?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of questions here in our legislature, can't even say it anymore, I've been out of it too long. And I think the governor, up to a certain point, they were worried, but he finally came around to support it. But they were worried about the finances
Yes.
of North Star, right? I think that was a big issue for us.
That was one of the really big issues for a lot of people. They were just concerned if there was enough money there to do it, efficiently and quickly.
Right.
I didn't really, and I still don't understand that concern, because there were so many regulations to set up that fund to begin with,
Right.
to make sure that you had enough money to decommission it at the end. So all the homework was done previously. Obviously, there's inflation and changes in doing business and things like that. But I would think that those things were taken into consideration
right.
when this trust fund was built. So North Star and Entergy worked together and provided some financial securities on top of what was already there to kind of help with those concerns.
And they said that, probably skipping ahead to questions I planned to ask, but they said they wouldn't touch the decommissioning fund if they went over their projected expenditure. Something that they said was like, at some point, if it got to be way above what they predicted, they would probably take it out of their own pockets, right?
Yeah, so in the way that the actual work is set up, it's not really possible for them to go overspending.
Yeah, that'd be a heck of a promise to make if I was them.
Yeah, it is a big promise to make, but I try to explain it to people this way. It's like having your house remodeled, and you only pay the contractor as they finish a project. So if they replace the cabinets, then you pay them for the cabinets. They do your bathroom, you pay them for the bathroom, which is how some contractors work. The same way happens with Vermont Yankee. There's about 900 steps to this decommissioning process that happen, and they get paid for each one of those steps out of that trust fund. So there really is no way for them to overspend because until a project's done, they don't get the payment, and the payment is already set up to exactly what it's supposed to be for that project.
So they must have had money coming into it to even get them to that phase where they could wait to get your money. And so they've got to have enough money in their own books, right?
Yeah, North Star has, some financial securities to get themselves off the ground. And they've been here for at least 4 years, I believe.
They started doing site work even before the sale.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, they actually started doing work before the sale on as a subcontractor for Entergy.
Can I ask you, I was in the legislature when all of this kind of hit the fan, there were guys that we worked with all the time from Vermont Yankee. Are some of them still there, or is it a whole new crew that came in? Because the guys that we worked with certainly knew their stuff and knew the history of Vermont and all the little quirks and things.
So most of the executive level is gone as of about a week ago. They retained about 3 executives for a while, and now those folks are gone now that the sale is completed and North Star, owns the facility. They're just not essential in the area anymore. As far as Vermont Yankee employees go, there's about 30 still on site for decommissioning. Corey Daniels is one of them. He's in charge of the ISFAC. Been with Vermont Yankee, I believe, 20 years.
That name sounds familiar.
Yep. So he's one that they held on to, and they tried to hold on to as many as they possibly could.
'Cause they've got the background
They
and the
have the
experience.
institutional knowledge of that plant, and it was, as I mentioned before, they're about a third of North Star staff at Vermont Yankee are previous Entergy employees.
Interesting.
So,
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the timeline here.
No, it's okay.
So what is, obviously the community is still kind of adjusting to this, right? And it seems like, certainly it's not the 650 employees, but at least there is some presence, and revenue being driven from that plant. You've got North Star people who are there. You've got a few of these Entergy folks that have stuck around, whether they're retired or still working for North Star. So what is the impact to the community been, and what are you doing to kind of address that, that hole that's been left?
The biggest impact of the community, there's 2 big impacts in my opinion. One is financial, and one is community related. So when you have 650 people that work in your little town, they turn into baseball coaches, they turn into basketball coaches, they do, the volunteer work of the town here and there. Entergy actually paid their employees when they did volunteer work, like they were at work.
Oh, wow.
So they had some good incentive to help in the community in that respect, and many of them did. So we lost all those volunteers that used to do all the work. That's probably the most important thing in my mind. The financial side kind of comes second. We lost millions of dollars in tax revenue. There's,
Right.
and with no way to replace it.
How many of them had to leave the community to find jobs? Were they able to find jobs that even compare to what they were making? Probably
The
not.
majority of them left to go to other plants in North
Yeah.
Carolina and various other places, Mississippi. There was a few that I know that have started their own business. That took, stayed a little extra time, and Entergy gave them a little kicker for staying extra time, and then took that money and parlayed it into their own
Good for them.
businesses.
Right.
So that was really nice to see that, some of those people were able to stay within the community and start their own business and, provide jobs and that kind of thing through doing
What
that.
kind of jobs have spun off from Entergy program employees? Like what kind of businesses have spun up?
One that I know the most of, so I'll give him a little shout out, is Bird Dog Home Inspection, and he's based out of his house in Vernon. He's a home inspector, runs around all over the counties and inspects houses, which is a huge need for us. I think there was about one home inspector in the entire county.
Great.
So he filled that void as this gentleman's about to retire. So we're seeing that, a lot of these guys that worked in trades at Vermont Yankee are filling the holes of the guys that are retiring from the trades, because that's one of the biggest holes that we have right now in the economy in general, in all the United States, is filling those trade jobs.
And
Yeah,
there's certainly
totally.
no jobs in Vermont that would even compare to what they were doing. So there's no
Yes.
transferable skills, as we would say.
Yes.
Depends. I mean, if you're like a mechanic and you're working on
Well,
the
that's-
ventilation
you could be working on
system,
anything.
right? That
Yeah.
that
Yep.
skill translates.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
just you're working on ventilation in
When I had
commercial
them-
building instead of a power plant.
Yes.
My first
Yep.
job here in Vermont was working for Simmons Precision. I ran an outplacement service for they laid off about 50, mostly aerospace engineers.
Wow.
So they were gone.
Yeah,
Not too
they're not
many
coming
here
back.
in Vermont,
No.
so
No.
You can go to
we helped
GE.
them find.
Well, actually, there's a fair amount today,
Maybe now, but not back
Not
then.
back then. I mean, you've
Yeah.
got UTC, you've got GE, there's a
Right.
place up in St. Albans that's doing that.
Yeah, I think they would have been very glad to stay because your kids are here. They're in school. And
Yes.
you've got to bring them out and start all over again.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's sad. Anyway, so we're at stop at 2018.
Yeah.
This is a busy year. You got a whole bunch of things happening this year.
Yeah,
Last year.
so they got all the spent fuel onto the storage pad, which is called the ISFAC. If I could remember what that stands for, I would.
Oh, good. I was going to ask you to
Yes.
spell it because I have no idea what you said. What
But that's a dry store cask.
Yes,
right?
it's a
Yeah.
dry store cask. There are, I believe, 62 casks, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, and there is one yet to be transferred out, and that would
Oh.
actually be the head of the reactor itself will go into a cask. So the rest of them just hold the fuel, but the head of the reactor is so contaminated that it needs to
It's
go
to
into
stay.
dry cask storage as
Yeah.
well and not be transferred
And that's
anywhere.
Ispices?
ISFAC.
I'm
So I think it's ISFSI.
just going to
Ispices.
look it
And
up.
these are basically like you put this in a huge concrete cylinder, pretty much. Is
Yes,
what these are.
it's a big metal cylinder that goes inside a concrete cylinder that sits on the largest concrete pad I've ever seen in my life.
And is
There we
this
go.
what someday the government's going to come and take away?
That's
You say
the hope.
laughingly.
That's
say
that's the
laughingly.
hope. That is that's the future supposedly. The Yucca Mountain project is
Right.
obviously one of the options for the federal government to send that stuff down the road.
Right.
Do I have hope of that happening in my lifetime? Probably
Yeah,
not.
let's
Probably
not-
not even in my kid's lifetime.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's a possibility, but you never know.
How many? So, because that was all the spent fuel was supposed to be the federal government's responsibility,
Correct.
right? And that hasn't, for one reason or another, panned out.
Yes.
Yucca Mountain being one of those
Yep.
stories. So all of this fuel is just sitting on location at these decommissioned plants, right?
Correct. Yep.
Do we know how much fuel that is? Like how much is sitting at these plants that have been decommissioned over the last 30 or 40 years?
I don't know what a total would be off the top of my head, but it's significant, and it's just going to get higher. There's 22 plants across the
Right.
country right now that are slated for decommissioning. So, if you figure and Vermont Yankee was actually a pretty small power plant
Right.
comparatively to some others.
Yeah.
If we have 60 some odd casks in our single boiler unit, and you talk about some of these larger ones that'll have over 100 casks apiece, and you start multiplying that over, 30 or 40 nuclear plants that are either decommissioning or in the process or scheduled for decommissioning, that's a lot of waste.
Now, Vermont Yankee had the approval for 2 plants on its facility, right, or in its facility, right? Weren't they, there was a room for 1 more, they said.
That's probably the case because
Yeah.
it's 125
Yeah.
acres there.
We talked about that on one of the shows, that they,
Yeah.
because that would happen, like, try building a nuclear power plant in Vermont.
Again?
Yeah, again, that didn't happen,
Yeah.
but anyway.
It's actually one of my goals.
Is it really?
Yes.
Good for you, because things have
It's-
changed, it's gotten better and better. And
Yeah, it's
safer and
becoming more
safer.
of a viable alternative
Yeah,
now. in a lot of
and
ways.
for me, it's one of those that's way out in left field, as you
Yes,
mentioned.
right,
It's
right.
Vermont,
Right,
but a reuse of that site. There's a new company based out of Washington State that just had their reactor approved by the NRC,
really?
and it's a modular reactor, so it kind of acts like
New
a
technology?
yeah. It's kind of works like egg cartons. However many you want, up to 12, you put, and depending on how many you have, is the production that it makes.
Wow,
So it's very new technology. The majority of the reactor is actually buried in the ground. So there's not,
Right.
that big reactor sticking up.
yeah.
Right, you don't
So-
have all that concrete necessarily.
Maybe out of sight, out
so-
of mind, right?
I don't know. I don't know. So it is definitely something that I would like to see happen.
Right, sure.
As part of our redevelopment in Vernon. Will it ever happen? I don't know. Like I said, it's my left field idea, and we're working on other.
Well, if-
You have some of that
options as well.
infrastructure there too, though, because you have, whatever the connection is, the
Yes,
grid.
we have
right?
the Velco power station, which
Right.
can handle everything.
Well, it would
Yeah.
seem to me that people in Vernon and the surrounding areas certainly seemed accepting of the plant, so you've got that battle
Very much so.
already conquered, right? To
Yeah.
trying to talk to the community, and they had such a good experience community-wise.
Yeah, the majority of the people that were against the plant were not anywhere near from Vermont
Oh,
or
yeah, right.
or surrounding communities.
Busload them in.
They really do. I mean, they are what I call professional stakeholders. Wherever there is money to be
They'll be
made, that's
there.
where they live for that amount of time
Wonderful.
or whatever they do.
Right.
So
Yep. So,
So-
at least short term, what fills the void left by Vermont Yankee in terms of the power generation, right? Because that's a
Sure.
really big power generator that you can't just
Yep.
spin up somewhere else, right?
Yes.
So where is that, capacity, that grid capacity coming from in the short term?
So the majority of our power for Vermont now comes from Hydro-Quebec. So we're
Right.
buying, hydro dam power from Canada to run Vermont. So the Yankees at one time supplied about a third of Vermont's power. They ended up cutting the agreement with him when Governor Shumlin was in office because one of his big sticks when he ran for governor is that he would shut down Vermont Yankee, and by increasing taxes to them and reducing their contract with the state of Vermont, he was able to get it done. And it's affected our rates across New England, not just in
Right,
Vermont,
right.
because Vermont Yankee sold to everybody, not just Vermont
We
itself.
have some information here about the rates.
Yeah.
Maybe we could
Yeah,
take a look
absolutely.
at that. Because that was always a big concern of people when Yankee closed, is how much.
Yeah, and I will never say that these stats that I have are just because of Vermont Yankee.
No, it's a lot of stuff, I'm
There's
sure.
so many factors
Right.
that play into it, but it's kind of odd how it works because the average bill for a Vermonter is actually ranks 33rd in the United States. So our bills are actually fairly low.
Right.
But that's because our usage is really low. So if you think about everywhere else that you travel outside of New England, most everybody has air conditioning. Regardless of whether
Right.
they have winter months or not,
Right.
they have a central AC unit outside. I'm originally from Indiana. My parents live in Indiana still. We have always had central AC in our homes that we lived in. And so that's a huge power draw when you have one of those running. And that's the majority of the United States that
Yeah.
does that.
And in Vermont, you may need it for like 6 weeks out of the
Yes.
year.
In
Exactly.
the window of the bedroom you sleep in, that's
Yes,
where that
right.
That's
That's
exactly
how it
right.
is.
Unit,
That's
right?
exactly
Yeah.
right. So we actually use less energy. That's why our
Yeah.
bills are less. But when you look at the actual rates themselves, we pay about 17 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the 5th highest in the nation. So we're just barely behind places like Hawaii and Alaska that have a hard time getting power because of their remote locations. We pay such a high rate. The average rate within the states is about $12. We pay over $17 a kilowatt hour in the state of Vermont.
Okay, I have to, completely went over my head, and I don't mind
Sure.
appearing to my audience that I'm a little dense.
Sure.
Why did you say that? What happened? What's different about us?
The what's different about us is that we buy a lot of our power from Hydro-Quebec,
I see.
and we use a lot of renewable energy.
And it was cheaper from Yankee, obviously, so,
Yes.
okay, I
Yep.
got it. Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, we're having to transmit
Yeah.
power from Canada down to us versus having
So
the
our
power station in our backyard.
I see.
the
Oh,
Vermont
yeah,
average is about 17 cents a kilowatt
Yep.
versus the national average is about 12, right?
Correct.
So we're paying about 5 cents more per kilowatt than the national average.
Maine must be a little high up there too, because we were camping this summer,
Mm-hmm.
and for the month, we got our electric bill for an RV, one bedroom.
Sure.
It was more than our electricity at home, which kind of threw us a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was not exactly by cents, it was by dollars.
Sure.
And we were surprised at that. So if you come visit, you can't put on anything electric.
Don't turn on the Sorry.
Yeah,
They'll
if
give you
you
candles.
if you look at those rankings of who pays the highest electricity outside of Alaska and Hawaii, it is New England states.
Yeah,
So
Yeah, and a lot of that is probably because there's not a whole lot of energy production here,
Correct.
right?
Right.
We don't have an energy source necessarily, which is a little ironic because we used to have, a leading energy source in all
Sure.
of our streams and rivers and stuff.
Yep.
But that's not really the case anymore when we're talking about large-scale industrial
Yeah,
power generation.
And if you look at especially the nuclear power plants that are being closed, the majority of the ones that are being closed right now are concentrated in this area of the country,
interesting.
or previously closed, like Maine Yankee and Yankee Row.
Yeah, and a lot of the power generation for New England, baseload power anyway, is being piped in from like Pennsylvania and New York
Correct.
through natural gas pipelines.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah.
So right now, in 2019, the sale's been approved and completed.
Yes.
And it took them, 2 years to approve this?
Yes, it was a
We're
very,
just moving
very
right
long
along, aren't we?
process. It was a very long process.
Oh, my gosh. Because we could have been a little ahead of the game if they had approved it faster.
Yes. Yep. And everybody did their due diligence. I'm not, upset that it took that long. Would it have been nice for it to take a year and a
Right.
half? Yes.
Right.
But now we know from every single angle that we have the right person that's
Yeah.
doing the
That's right.
decommissioning
That's right.
and is the owner of the plant.
Well, you had a lot of public hearings too, and you really included whether one wanted to or not. I mean, that was probably part of the process to make sure the public, because we went down
Correct.
to one. I think you went more than one. I don't know. Did you?
Oh
go
yes,
that
I
one?
went
Or a
to
bunch of them?
I don't know, probably 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah, I was just impressed that the tone was respectful and they
Sure.
just
Yep.
said their thing, and then that was the night I was down there when the governor's letter arrived that he approved
Yes.
what was going on in the sale.
Yeah, I had made a trip up here to Mount Pelier
Right.
and knocked on his door and
Said,
had a
"You're
meeting
signing
with
it."
him and said, please submit this letter. I know
Yeah.
you support it, but I
Yeah.
need, And he was very gracious in
Yeah.
getting that done quickly prior to that
Yeah, that
meeting.
was a good meeting. I actually learned some things there too, so that's
And
a
that
good thing.
committee actually still exists.
Oh, really?
That's the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel.
And they will oversee this whole decommissioning? and-
Throughout the whole
As the
decommissioning
NRC will
process.
too, I'm assuming.
Yes. Yeah, the NRC has people on site on a regular basis,
Oh.
actually, and the PUC does as well, and Public Service from the state of Vermont. They check in regularly on the plan.
So now I read, and I don't know how true this is, that there are 3 overarching stages of decommissioning. That's secure the long-term storage, carefully decontaminate and dismantle, and then the third is restore the land for future use. But you
Correct.
mentioned before that they've got 900 subsets of that
Yes.
in those different categories. So
Yep.
can you even explain? Each one comes with its own budget, which is probably true because they want the money for each
Correct.
of the steps. So how do you even explain what these steps do? I mean,
It very much
900 is
is.
a lot.
Yeah, it very much is a very detailed process.
Right.
And once this particular thing is done, for example, the cooling towers that were outside the Vermont Yankee
Right.
property were just taken down about a month or 2 ago. Those buildings were 42 feet high, 42 feet wide, and over 400 feet long.
Ugh.
And they had to be mitigated before they came down
Right.
for asbestos and anything else that was in there, which took several months to complete. And then I got to watch one of the cooling towers come down, and it was about 2.5 hours to put a 400-foot building on the ground, which I thought was amazing.
Now,
in the
where did the
efficiency of
asbestos
work.
come from? Was that built into the tower itself from 100 years ago? or-
Yeah, it was actually in the building materials
Oh.
of, because back then it was,
Sure,
you know,
thing to
started
do.
in 66 and,
Yep.
you know, came online in 72. So a lot of the building materials that were used contained
Right.
asbestos.
And they're not a
Yeah.
danger unless they're messed with or cracked or opened.
Right, you have to
Right.
very
And those
carefully
little guys with the
remove-
white come in and scare
Yes.
the heck
Yeah.
out of you.
Yep.
Yes, yeah. So one of the things that I find really interesting, that some numbers from ISO New England, which is the controller for pretty much all power in New England.
Sure.
It's kind of a product of some of the rolling blackouts that happened back around the middle of the century,
Right.
to try to stabilize the grid
Yep.
in New England, because it's all kind of interconnected. But some of the numbers that they put out, which are interesting, is it actually looks like Vermont Yankee, when it closed, increased carbon emissions by 2.9% because the grid didn't have a renewable or low carbon alternative
That's correct.
to the power that was being
Yeah.
generated.
Yep.
So it increased carbon emissions by almost 3%, which in relative terms is about 1,000 tons of carbon
Yes.
just in 2015, which is the year after Yankee closed.
Yeah, and that was the first increase that we'd seen in carbon emissions in the state of Vermont, I think, in 10 years. We were actually on a 10-year decline
Right.
of our carbon emissions prior to Yankee closing down. The very next year, it went up by 2%. But when you lose a baseload power source, like a nuclear power plant, it's the coal plants and all those that have to make that up so we don't have rolling brownouts and blackouts in New England
Right.
again.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
ISO just met in Portland, which was why Meredith Angwin, who's been on the show before a couple times
Mm-hmm.
because her knowledge of nuclear power.
Well, and Meredith is a
Nuclear physicist.
nuclear physicist.
Can't
yeah,
even say the
so,
word.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Exactly.
But I think the point which is interesting is that nuclear is actually a low carbon
Right.
a low carbon power source.
Yes.
During production, it uses virtually no carbon. It's the
Exactly.
it's the startup, it's the commissioning and decommissioning phase that create carbon.
Correct.
Which was one of the arguments to keep it
Right.
of
Right.
the
Yes.
low carb because we were so interested in that in Vermont.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, just a few years ago when it was closed, that wasn't even thought about. But as you mentioned earlier, it's now being rethought about. Within the last 12 months, there's been more and more studies of why
interesting.
nuclear power is beneficial, because we need a heavier baseload power. Renewables are great,
Right.
solar's great, wind's great in their own category, but they can't provide the baseload power that the country needs.
Right.
essentially.
Wind's losing a little of its appeal. We haven't heard much lately about new wind farms starting
Yeah.
up, and
Yeah.
I think we've backed away from that.
Yeah.
Well, there's wind has its own issues in terms of runoff and
Right.
Sure.
And people getting sick.
yeah, sound pollution
Right.
and
Well,
and what's interesting I find is the numbers show that nuclear power, at least modern nuclear power, is actually has a lower life cycle carbon impact than solar does.
correct.
Which is interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think that off the bat. But if you look at from the mining of the silica that goes into those, to the solar panels, to the production of them, to the shipping of them, to the installation, and then you maybe have like a 10 or 15 year life expectancy out of the panel before you have to replace it. It actually comes out that solar is actually has a higher carbon impact
Right,
than
is it?
nuclear does.
You are
Interesting.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
And the amount of solar panels that you need to make up for, the base load power of a nuclear plant is astronomical.
Mhm.
So we mentioned, the low carbon, non-carbon. Solar and wind have been getting tax credits for that for years.
Yeah.
Right.
A no carbon power emission. Nuclear has always been left out of that equation, not sure why. That has started to change a little bit. There's a few states that have started allowing those tax credits
Oh,
for
good.
nuclear plants. I actually do quite a bit of traveling in that vein. I've been to Ohio and New Jersey and probably will end up in Pennsylvania this year as
Really?
their
Great.
legislature considers giving those tax credits. Ohio just did it this last session, provided those tax credits to save 2 of their small power
That's
plants
great.
that are right along the Erie, Lake Erie. And we were talking about what does it take for a solar or wind to replace just those 2 power plants. And they're not big plants, they're very similar to Yankee. And you would have to cover the entire coast of Lake Erie, a mile deep, with
Wow.
wind turbines to replace the power of those 2 plants.
Wow.
Yep.
And you would have to cover the entire town of Akron, Ohio, which is, I think the population is somewhere around 100,000 people, so it's not a small town. You would have to cover the entire town with solar panels to replace the power of those 2 power plants.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Have you ever heard much about it's either Indian Point or Indian Head on the Hudson in Ossining?
Indian Point.
Is
Yep.
any point? I lived in a condo that stuck out in the Hudson, and I had a direct view of the
Yeah.
plant. They never all the years I've lived there, never had any trouble. To this day, there's just no problem.
Indian Point, I believe, was just sold to Holtec, which is another decommissioning company.
Oh, so they're gonna close down too?
Yep.
It's gone its life cycle? I would
Indian
think
Point
so.
is gone.
Yeah.
North Star, who owns Vermont Yankee, is purchasing Crystal River, which is in Florida. That one will be coming down
Wow.
under the North Star banner. So there's
Interesting.
a lot of
It's
communities.
about 40 years, is that about it for the plant?
Seems about what the life cycle has been.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree that that's the useful life cycle. Vermont Yankee, as an example, got relicensed.
Yeah, oh, that's true, I remember that.
And when they it was shortly after they got relicensed that they announced the decommissioning. And I think it was more of a power play than anything
Right.
by Entergy to
Right.
just say, this is still okay,
Right.
regardless of what you think or not.
Right.
And they got the nod and then said, okay, we're
done.
gone. So
Yeah.
Too bad.
A little bit of a mic drop there.
a little bit.
A little
And I appreciated it at the time, and I still do from the nuclear community side.
So you think, how many years you're looking at before they hand you over the key to the land?
My guess is probably 10 years, as early as 8 years.
Oh,
Okay.
perfect, because when you were on the show last, you brought a young woman with you who worked at the town offices.
Yep. That was actually 2 shows ago. I think
Two-
that was
oh,
the
two-
first
oh,
show
2
we did,
shows.
because we were with Brad Ferlin that
Oh,
that
that's right, I
show as well.
apologize, that's
Yeah.
right. So you guys were talking about Greenfield, using as Greenfield Redevelopment Industrial Center.
Yes.
Have you sort of honed in? You had some good news of getting some help?
Yes, yeah, we are actually working with Antioch University to do some land studies and things like that, and they are going to, I think it's a 6-year study, and they're going to provide us some of the options that we have based on the land and, you know, what could be done there, the current infrastructure that sits there. As you mentioned, the Velco transfer
Right,
station, and so there's a lot of potential to do some sort of energy generation.
The site itself is beautiful. I mean, you're right on the river.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
on the
I mean, it's just gorgeous there.
It is.
It really
it is. And one of our main focuses in Vernon as well is to provide recreational access to
Right,
the river, because
right.
we really don't have a good spot. We have, you know, all this land along the river, but no real good way to get there as a Vernon resident, because we also have the hydro dam that sits in Vernon as well. So that kind of puts a stop to you going any further down the river or up the
Right.
river.
Oh, right, you can't quite boat over it.
Yeah, not exactly. So that would provide us a access to the river above the dam.
Is there another dam on the well, that's the Connecticut, right? That
Correct.
runs up. Is there another dam on the Connecticut, or is that really the only one?
No,
in Vermont?
there's actually several.
Yeah, because I thought we had the opportunity to buy 3 of those dams. I don't know if it was that one in particular, but
Yes,
we,
it-
of course, turned it down. I always thought that was a bad decision, but
Yeah.
what do I know?
Yeah, I believe, I'm trying to remember the company that owns the dams, it was TransCanada was either a previous owner or the current owner of the dam.
So is that energy, that power output realized by Vermont or New Hampshire? Because like that's right on the border, right?
Yeah, the power, similar to Vermont Yankee, is just, it's sold to the highest bidder. So it kind of depends on where.
Yeah. So it just goes
Where
back
they're
into the
selling it to.
ISO grid.
Yes,
pretty
it
much.
does. Yeah. And that plant, that dam has actually been online since 1909, I believe, was the original date of that plant. So Vernon, for being a really small community of 2,200 people, has had a really big hand in energy production over the last 100 years.
Yeah. Of course, the dam probably doesn't have as many jobs that go along with it as a nuclear plant does, but
Not at all, no.
yeah, yeah.
I think they have somewhere around 10 to 12 employees at the dam at any given time.
Gotcha.
So the land, when they turn it over to you,
Mm-hmm.
it's buildable. You can dig up the earth and build a basement, and people feel comfortable that all is well.
Yeah, so there is, in the nuclear world, there is a really weird, I guess I would call it a parable on how to understand how well anything's cleaned up. And it has something to do with a baby and a cow. And if Bob Leach, who we hired to work with us to understand, you know, the cleanup side of things and
Yeah.
understand what level we want to bring it to as a town, is a long-term employee of Vermont Yankee, was there from 1972 for, I think, maybe 30 some odd years before he retired. Told us all about this, you know, if the baby can be next to the cow for a year and not see any radiation impact to either of them, then
We're okay.
we're good. And it's some kind of weird old school nuclear standard
Probably
that's
wouldn't
out
follow
there.
that these days.
No,
No
but
babies
it's,
out on the
but,
land.
but it was very interesting when he was telling us about it, and I was like, wow, okay, well that makes sense. You know, if you'd have your kid and your farm animals out on the land, then you're in a
Right,
good
for sure,
place.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because they're eating and they're giving milk and,
Yes.
you know, and who knows.
Exactly.
I worked for a company years ago, a chemical company. I very rarely say that in public because you get yelled at in Vermont. But in Toms River, New Jersey, we had a plant that had an effluent problem. And they used to bring in these mysid shrimp. You couldn't see them unless you were looking through a microscope,
Wow.
whatever. And they had to last in the water for 30 seconds. If they died, wasn't good. And I was in the legal department back then, so
Wow.
down I go for all of the mysid shrimp tests. And it was because people were pretty upset with the plant. You didn't really run
amazing.
around saying I work at the Toms River
Sure,
plant
yeah.
when you went out to dinner. It'd be a very short meal.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was very interesting that they use these. That's the test. Who knew that that's a test? These little mysid shrimp, which
That's
they're about
funny.
this big, and you can't see them. So there you go.
Yep.
What you said. But it's good that you felt better when they lived.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah. So it's the same idea.
That is
Cows and babies and shrimp.
Except we want them to live longer than 30
Swim in that
seconds, you know.
These are swimming in that water. Oh, who knows? It's probably why I'm
goodness.
so tall, my father says.
Oh no. So the idea is to be able to return. Now there is still concrete in some structures in the ground itself, right?
The standard is 4 feet.
And some buildings
feet,
are staying. They're not being knocked down, so you could use them, right?
We're kind of
Decided.
in negotiation in that it was part of the MOU to leave some of the infrastructure
Right.
that was there if the town or developer
Right.
wanted
Right,
to have
right.
them.
So part of that probably depends on what you end up wanting to
decided,
do with the
yeah.
site.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And there's been some interest in the site already by developers,
Oh,
and
really?
actually one local developer that lives right in Vernon
Great.
as well. So the idea, I don't think right now is to have the town own the property. It's to find the right developer and be involved in the process of what's going to be there.
Now, even if a developer comes in and buys the property, North Star is probably still going to own the storage facility, right? That's
Yes,
there.
yes.
And they have, and that storage facility is kind of closed off from
Yes.
the rest of the property.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
when the
they're-
government comes in, they have to have access to it in 50,
Well,
60
and they have
years.
there's a train, there's a
That's
railroad
right.
that runs through, right, or a rail line?
Yes, so when North Star completed the sale, they opened up the rail spur that was used to actually build the plant.
Right.
So they're utilizing that to take the waste down to Texas, where they own a waste facility in Texas. There's the Texas-Vermont Compact to be able to send that stuff
Which has
down
been
there.
a little iffy, hasn't it been over the years? I'm remembering some conversations when I was working for state government about that compact and whether that was solid or not solid. And
It's working for us right
is it
now.
good?
We're
Well, I
sending
don't know
stuff
why-
down there.
I
so-
really don't remember the details. I just remember maybe people in Texas weren't too thrilled to have all
Yeah.
stuff coming down,
Well, it's
plunked in their
mostly
backyard.
concrete, right?
Yeah.
that's
It's
going
mostly
down.
concrete, and the majority of it is very low contaminant or
Oh,
not
really?
contaminant at all.
Ah,
And actually, the science behind decommissioning is just mind-boggling. You would think you tear a building down that doesn't have any contamination, you throw it on the rail car and you ship it away. But that's not the case. They actually have job boxes, is what I call them. They have a fancy term for them, that are built to take an exact structure or an exact piece of a structure
Oh.
to size. So as they take it down, they put it in the specific box for it, put it on the rail car, and send it down the road.
and this is a
it's-
self-contained.
It's almost more like
Yes.
Legos.
It
It's
is.
like a
Exactly.
giant
Very
Lego
much.
structure.
It's
Yeah.
very much
Yeah.
like
'Cause
Legos.
They're not
It's-
sure that even if they say it's decontaminated, it is it is.
Yes.
There's no nuclear.
Correct. There's a little low-level radiation that's going out, and that's why they go out in
Yeah.
those boxes, because
Interesting.
they are made to
Right.
withstand
Withstand
a
whatever.
lot.
Because there's certain, like, it's a little bit of radiation, but it's not like, a fuel rod level radiation.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
very, very low level, probably no more than you encounter in an airplane.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Another pleasant thought.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
or
it's
your
funny where,
cell
where
phone
you do
or
get
whatever.
where you do get radiation and
Yeah.
you don't realize it. I think cell phones is a perfect
Yeah.
example because they were talking
Yeah.
about people having little brain injuries here and there from
Exactly.
being on the cell
Well,
phone.
it's even watches. So everybody remembers the Tritium leak that happened at Vermont Yankee, and that was a huge topic. And when the actual science came out about it outside of the media blitz on it, if you drank from that well that had a tritium leak for a year, you would get the same amount of radiation as if you flew coast to coast in the United States
Excellent.
on an airplane.
There's something about the word tritium, though. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't sound good, though, does it? It's like tritium.
Unless
Yeah.
you're talking about the
Is it-
Tritium Brewery, in which case that
That's good.
does
That's-
sound good.
Tritium is bad. That's good.
Yeah,
That's good.
and actually, tritium is what lights up your watch as well. If you
Oh.
if you have a watch that glows
Oh, that's
when
it.
you push it so you can check the time at night, that's tritium lighting up your
Wow.
watch. So
So
There you
we
go.
have
Learn something
a
new every day.
few minutes left. What else would you like to talk about? I think we've covered an awful lot here.
yeah, we have.
And I've surprised at how much I remember. It's like bing.
Yeah.
It's fun. You have to invite us down when you hit the land, or any time you
Absolutely.
think would be something our viewers would like to see. We'd like to go down and take
Yeah.
a tour, take pictures. That'd
Yeah,
be really
totally.
cool.
Yeah.
Absolutely. North Star is very open to having, tours go through. The media goes through quite
Oh,
often.
really
and-
great. What, are we media? We're media.
Yeah.
Sure.
Why not?
media.
Yeah, we count.
You have
Yeah.
cameras. It's-
We do. We
You're
have
media.
we have 15 stations that cover us all over Vermont.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
that's cool.
We'd love to have you down the
Great,
next
thank
time
you.
there is something that's, say, outdoor or
You've
something
learned a
like
lot
that
over
that
the
we can
years.
see. Yeah, it's really actually kind of scary. I've only been in this position as a selectman for 4 years. I spent the
Right,
first,
right?
I think, year and a half as a member, and have spent the last couple of
Right.
years as the chair of the board. And to now be getting phone calls from other states and saying,
Right.
can you come talk to us about the
Oh,
economic
right.
impact of losing a power plant? It's kind of surreal. And
Yeah.
Different than ingress, egress problems.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
the important stuff you deal with on the select board.
Right.
Exactly.
You know, right.
I thought coming in, I was on the select board of a town of 2,200 people,
Right.
no big deal. You deal with dog and cat issues here and there, and
Yeah.
and then
Here you are.
it happens.
World traveling.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you
So-
very much, Josh. It's really
Yeah.
been excellent. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to visiting.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Go down there.
We'll
Thanks
have you
so
down
much.
soon.
Thank you all for
Yeah.
tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.